In a world where men tremble at his shadow and blood pays for every mistake, a 10-month-old baby girl reaches up and treats the most dangerous man in Asia like her favorite stuffed animal. The air in Kang Min-jae's marble hallway was always 10 degrees colder than the rest of Seoul, a silent warning to anyone who dared to linger. Zara Thompson knew this chill well. It was the atmosphere of a man who ruled through fear, and it was the reason she kept her head down and her daughter, Amara, tucked away in the shadows of the industrial kitchen. In a world where men trembled at Min-jae's shadow and blood paid for every minor infraction, Zara was a ghost, a widow covered in the dust of honest labor, clutching her child as if she could hide her from the darkness of the mansion. The Kang estate was a place of oppressive, silent opulence, where the air smelled of expensive cologne and the metallic tang of gunpowder. The heavy mahogany doors slid open with a sound like a guillotine, and Kang Min-jae walked through, a scarred titan flanked by armed lieutenants whose only job was to kill. Zara's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood frozen, desperation in her eyes, holding Amara against her apron. But the dragon of the underworld didn't see a threat. He saw a 10-month-old baby girl who didn't know enough to be afraid. In a moment that stopped the breath of every guard in the hall, Amara didn't scream or recoil from his tattooed face. Instead, she lunged forward with a toothy giggle, her tiny, soft hands reaching up to grab the jaw of the most dangerous man in Asia, as if he were nothing more than a favorite stuffed animal. The power dynamic of the city's most feared household shifted in a single heartbeat. The monster had been conquered by a child who saw a hero where the rest of the world saw a ghost. Zara Thompson was a widowed expat and former academic in Seoul, is down to her last one when she is forced to bring her 10-month-old daughter, Amara, to her shift at the fortified estate of Kang Min-jae, while Zara attempts to work covered in the dust of the estate's massive industrial kitchen. Amara escapes her playmat and crawls directly into the path of Min-jae and his armed. In a moment that freezes the entire household, the baby doesn't recoil from Min-jae's scarred, tattooed face. She realizes Min-jae's coldness is a mask for a man haunted by a lost family. When a rival syndicate targets the estate, Min-jae must decide if he will remain a monster or become the protector this mother and child believe him to be. Before the guards can intervene, Amara lunges forward. Instead of the screams that usually follow Min-jae, there is a giggle. The dragon freezes as the baby's small hand finds the scar on his cheek. For the first time in a decade, Min-jae doesn't reach for his weapon. He looks at the mother, trembling and ready to die for her child, and then back at the baby who sees a hero where everyone else sees a ghost. The power dynamic of the mansion shifts in a single heartbeat. The man who owns the city has just been conquered by a child who doesn't even know his name. If you are still with us, please consider to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more beautiful stories like this. And also, please drop in the comment section where you are watching us from. Let's unite together. Thank you, and let's continue. The scent of industrial bleach and scorched starch usually masked the scent of Zara's fear, but today, the air in the Kang estate felt dangerously thin. Zara Thompson moved with a frantic, silent rhythm, her hands covered in white flour as she prepped the morning's artisanal loaves for the household staff. On a small, colorful play mat, tucked beneath the heavy steel prep table, 10-month-old Amara was a burst of forbidden life in a house that demanded total invisibility. Zara had spent 3 weeks perfecting the art of being a ghost, a widow scrubbing the edges of a world that didn't want her there. The sudden rhythmic thud of combat boots against the marble outside sent a jolt of ice through Zara's veins. It was a surprise inspection, a display of controlled violence that Kang Min-jae used to ensure his fortress remained absolute. Zara lunged for Amara, scooping the child against her apron, her flour-smeared hands leaving white streaks against the baby's dark curls. She was a woman built of desperation, her body becoming a shield between her daughter and the darkness of the mansion. "Stay quiet, my love," Zara whispered, her voice barely a tremor as she pressed Amara's face into her shoulder. The kitchen doors hissed open, and the light from the hallway caught the glint of sidearms and the cold, unblinking eyes of Minjae's security detail. Zara stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against the baby's chest. To the guards, she was just the help, a flour-smeared non-entity. But to Amara, the tension was a game. Just as the lead guard turned his gaze toward the shadows beneath the prep table, Amara let out a sharp, joyful squeal. Zara's grip tightened, her eyes closing as she waited for the fallout of her broken invisibility. The guard's hand moved toward his holster, his face hardening into a mask of professional malice. Zara realized then that in this house, there were no accidents, only threats to be neutralized. She stepped out of the shadows, her chin lifted despite the terror, presenting herself and her child to the cold judgment of the dragon's men. She was no longer just a cleaner, she was a mother at war, and the first battle for Amara's survival had officially begun. The lead guard's hand hovered over his weapon, his eyes narrowing as he moved to radio the breach of protocol. But the kitchen doors hissed open again with a finality that silenced the room. Kang Minjae walked in, a storm-made flesh wrapped in a tailored black suit that barely concealed the lethal power beneath. He was a man of controlled violence, his jaw set, and his eyes, the eyes of a predator who had survived 17 attempts on his life, sweeping the staff with absolute coldness. Zara stood paralyzed, her flour-streaked hands trembling against Amara's back, as she felt the temperature in the room plummet. In the sudden, suffocating silence, Amara's curiosity outweighed Zara's terror. The infant felt the change in the air, but she didn't sense a monster. She saw a face that stood out from the sea of fearful uniformed staff. With a sudden, energetic lunge, Amara squirmed out of Zara's slick, flour-dusted grip. Before Zara could gasp, her daughter was on the floor, crawling with a determined, toothy grin toward the man the rest of the world called the Dragon. The lieutenants reached for their holsters, their instincts primed to eliminate anything that moved too fast toward their boss. "Stand down," Minjae commanded, his voice a low, terrifyingly soft rumble that made the guards freeze mid-motion. He looked down as the small child reached his boots, his face a mask of scarred titanium that usually sent grown men to their knees in prayer. Amara didn't hesitate. She used the hem of his expensive trousers to pull herself up, her tiny, soft hands reaching toward the jagged scar that ran along his cheekbone. The entire kitchen held its breath, expecting the worst. Instead, Amara's fingers, still white with the flour from her mother's apron, clapped onto Minjae's jaw with a sound of pure, innocent delight. The dragon froze. For the first time in a decade, a human being was touching him without fear or a hidden blade. He looked into the baby's brown eyes and saw an absence of warmth that matched his own history, yet her touch was filled with an inexplicable, terrifyingly calm trust. Zara's knees nearly buckled as she watched the most feared man in Seoul reach out, not to push the child away, but to catch her as she wobbled. His expression cracked, a brief flash of shock crossing his face before the mask slammed back down. "She is fearless," he observed, his gaze finally shifting to Zara, who stood in the shadows like a ghost of the life he once lost. The silence in the industrial kitchen was so absolute that the hum of the refrigerators sounded like a roar. Zara stood paralyzed, her breath hitched in her throat as she watched her daughter's flour-dusted fingers rest against the jagged scar on Kang Minjae's jaw. The guards remained like statues of cold marble, their hands still hovering near their holsters, waiting for the dragon to breathe fire. Zara expected a dismissal, or worse, a violent removal from the property she had spent 3 weeks trying to haunt like a silent ghost. Instead, Min-jae's hand, large and etched with the tattoos of his rank, moved with a slow, deliberate grace. He didn't pull away. He supported Amara's small frame as she leaned into him, her toothy grin reflecting in the polished sheen of his black suit. The storm-made flesh seemed to still, his eyes fixed on the child with a depth of focus that suggested he was seeing something far beyond the marble walls of his estate. "This child does not know fear," Min-jae murmured, his voice a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the room. "That is a dangerous luxury in this house." He finally shifted his gaze to Zara, his expression neutral, but his eyes raking over her flour-smeared apron and the desperation etched into her features. Zara felt the weight of his judgment, a clinical evaluation of her worth and her peril. She opened her mouth to apologize, to beg for her job, to promise she would vanish and never bring Amara back. "Pack your things," Min-jae interrupted, his tone shifting back to the absolute authority that commanded an empire. Zara's heart plummeted, her knees nearly buckling at the thought of the eviction notice waiting at her apartment. But he wasn't finished. "You will no longer be scrubbing floors. Starting today, you and the child will move into the guest wing of the main house. It is the only part of this fortress with reinforced glass and a private perimeter." The lieutenants traded stunned glances, their professional masks slipping for a fraction of a second. The guest wing was reserved for high-ranking associates, not the help. Zara blinked, the dragon's mercy feeling more like a new kind of cage. "Sir? I don't understand. The child has marked me," Min-jae said, looking back at Amara, who was now patting his silk tie with sticky, delighted hands. "In my world, what I touch, others target. For the child's safety, and perhaps for your own, you stay where I can see you." He carefully transferred the baby back into Zara's shaking arms, the white flower from Amara's hands now a permanent mark on his dark lapel. As he turned to leave, his dark coat flared like a wing, leaving Zara standing in the center of a life that had just been irrevocably rewritten. The heavy mahogany doors of the primary conference room groaned open, revealing a space where the air was thick with the scent of bitter espresso and the unspoken threat of a silent war. Zara stood at the threshold, her pulse an erratic drumbeat against her ribs, as she clutched a diaper bag like a tactical shield. Beside her, Kang Min-jae moved with the lethal grace of a predator, his dark, tailored suit a stark contrast to the small, bright-eyed infant currently anchored to his hip. Amara had spent the morning wailing at the mere suggestion of being left with the new nanny, her tiny fists knotting into Min-jae's silk tie with a grip that even the dragon of soul couldn't seem to break. As they entered, a dozen men in charcoal suits, high-ranking lieutenants and representatives from the triads, rose in a synchronized motion that usually signaled the start of a bloody negotiation. The room went airtight. Eyes that were trained to spot a hidden wire or a double cross flickered toward the 10-month-old girl patting the dragon's scarred jaw. Zara felt the weight of their judgment, 100 clinical evaluations of this new, soft vulnerability in their leader's armor. She took her seat in the corner, her presence an anomaly of bibs and boardrooms. In a sanctuary of controlled violence, Min-jae didn't offer an explanation. He sat at the head of the table, his tattooed neck tensing as he adjusted Amara so she could see the room. "The shipment through Busan is late," he began, his voice a low-frequency hum that commanded absolute silence despite the child now gnawing on a teething ring at the center of the table. Zara watched with a mixture of terror and awe as Min-jae navigated a $40 million dispute while simultaneously shifting his weight to keep Amara comfortable. The tension peaked when a triad envoy leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the baby rather than the ledger. "You've grown soft, Kang, bringing a domestic distraction to a table of kings." The temperature in the room plummeted 20 degrees. Min-jae didn't reach for the handgun in his shoulder holster. Instead, he looked at Amara, who was staring at the envoy with a curious, unblinking intensity. "The child sees what I see," Min-jae said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft whisper. "And right now, she sees a man who is talking himself into a shallow grave." Zara realized then that Amara wasn't a distraction. She was a litmus test for loyalty. As the envoy paled and backed away, Zara caught the briefest flicker of a ghost of amusement on Min-jae's face. The meeting continued, a surreal ballet of corporate crime and nursery rhymes, where the most feared man in Asia proved that his new found family wasn't a weakness. It was a new kind of weapon. The moon hung low over the Kang estate, casting long, blue-tinted shadows across the nursery that mirrored the cold glow of the command center where Zara had once scrubbed floors. Amara lay fast asleep in a crib of reinforced steel and silk, her breathing the only soft sound in a house built on silence. Kang Min-jae stood by the window, his dark silhouette a sharp contrast to the glittering Seoul skyline beyond the bulletproof glass. He had discarded his suit jacket, the collar of his white shirt open to reveal the intricate, dark tattoos that coiled up his neck like a warning. Zara entered the room, moving with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to navigate the controlled violence of the mansion without making a sound. She found Min-jae staring at the jagged scar on his own reflection, his fingers tracing the mark that Amara had claimed as her own. The dragon looked less like a monster in the moonlight and more like a relic of a war that had never ended. "She has your eyes when she's quiet," Min-jae said softly, his voice a low-frequency hum that didn't disturb the sleeping child. "But she has the spirit of someone who has never known a cage." He turned to Zara, the blue light catching the absolute absence of warmth that usually defined his expression. Except tonight, the mask was slipping. He told her then of a sister he had once tried to shield, a small girl who had been the only light in a world of concrete and blood. He spoke of the night that light was extinguished because he hadn't been fast enough or cold enough to stop the shadows. "I spent a decade turning myself into a storm so that nothing could ever touch me again," he whispered, his tattooed hand resting on the railing of Amara's crib. "I thought I had succeeded until your daughter grabbed my face and looked at me as if I were human." Zara watched him, her crippling fear beginning to dissolve into something more complex, a realization that they were both survivors of different kinds of wreckage. In the silence of the nursery, the dragon revealed his deepest secret. He didn't want Amara to be fearless because of his power. He wanted her to be safe because he had finally found something worth more than his empire. The silence of the estate was shattered at 3:14 a.m. by the rhythmic mechanical thud of a breaching charge echoing from the lower perimeter. Zara was thrown from sleep into a world of blue-tinted shadows and the cold electronic wail of the mansion's high-alert siren. She scrambled toward the nursery, her breath hitching as the controlled violence of Kang Min-jae's world finally tore through the front gates. The hallways, once filled with the scent of expensive polish, now smelled of ozone and cordite as the Park Syndicate's mercenaries made their move. Zara burst into the nursery to find Min-jae already there, a dark silhouette against the flickering emergency lights. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned, revealing the intricate tattoos on his neck and chest that seemed to writhe in the strobe-like light. He held a submachine gun in one hand and Amara's diaper bag in the other, his expression a mask of scarred titanium. "The nursery glass is reinforced, but we are leaving," he commanded, his voice a low-frequency hum that cut through the chaos. "They aren't here for my ledgers, Zara. They are here for my heart. A window on the far side of the hallway exploded, raining deadly glass like snow. Zara lunged for Amara, scooping the wide-eyed baby into her arms, just as Min-jae pushed them toward a hidden seam in the mahogany wall. The panic room code is 08 Amphiv, he whispered, his tattooed hand briefly touching Amara's cheek with a tenderness that defied the war raging around them. He looked at Zara, his dark eyes burning with a promise of total systemic erasure for anyone who crossed the threshold. Do not come out until you hear my voice, only mine. As the hidden door hissed shut, sealing Zara and Amara in a vault of steel and silence. The last thing Zara saw was Min-jae turning back toward the hallway. He looked like the storm-made flesh, a man who had finally found something worth defending with more than just money. Outside, the gunfire erupted like thunder, a fierce showdown between the dragon and the ghosts of his past. Zara huddled on the floor of the panic room, clutching her daughter and realizing that in this house, the only thing more dangerous than the enemies at the gate was the man standing between them. Inside the panic room, the air was stale and tasted of cold metal, a sharp contrast to the chaotic, controlled violence unfolding on the other side of the steel. Zara huddled on the floor, her eyes fixed on a bank of monitors that displayed the estate's security grid in grainy, blue-tinted light. On the screens, she watched the dragon transform into a shadow of absolute systemic erasure. Kang Min-jae moved through the smoke-filled corridors with lethal precision, his white shirt stained with crimson as he cleared the estate floor by floor. He wasn't just a mafia boss defending territory, he was a man fighting for the found family he had discovered in the most unlikely of places. Amara sat on the floor of the vault, oblivious to the fierce showdown occurring above her, reaching for the flickering screens as if the violence were merely another game. Zara watched as Min-jae entered the master suite, his tattooed profile illuminated by the muzzle flashes of his weapon as he neutralized the final breach of the Park Syndicate. Every movement he made was a calculation of blood and cradle, ensuring that the path back to the nursery was cleared of every threat. The monitors showed the hallway where Zara had once scrubbed the marble. It was now a graveyard of glass and spent shells, a testament to the cost of crossing the man who had been conquered by a child's grin. As the last of the invaders fell, Min-jae leaned against the wall of the nursery, his breath coming in ragged, heavy bursts. Through the audio feed, Zara could hear the metallic clatter of his empty magazine hitting the floor, a sound that felt like a period at the end of a long, violent sentence. He didn't look at the cameras. He looked at the jagged scar on his jaw, the one Amara had claimed with her tiny, soft hands. The storm-made flesh was beginning to subside, leaving behind a man who looked almost human in his exhaustion. Suddenly, the intercom crackled to life, the sound of Min-jae's voice, terrifyingly soft but steady, breaking the oppressive silence of the panic room. "It's over, Zara," he whispered, the code for their safety buried in the tone of his voice. "The house is quiet." Zara felt the crippling fear finally begin to lift, replaced by a realization that the dragon had fulfilled his promise of total protection. She stood up, clutching Amara to her chest, and prepared to walk back into a world that had been bathed in blood, but was now, finally, their own. The panic room door hissed open, and the scent of gunpowder and ozone rushed into the vault, clashing with the sterile smell of the safety Zara had just left behind. Kang Min-jae stood in the doorway, his appearance a jarring image of blood and cradle. His white shirt was torn and splattered with dark crimson, and the jagged scar on his cheek was now accompanied by a fresh, shallow cut that wept red down his jaw. He looked like a storm-made flesh that had finally been weathered, his breathing heavy and his tattooed neck tensing with the effort of remaining upright. Zara stepped out of the vault, her arms trembling as she held Amara. The mansion was silent again, But it was a heavy silence, the kind that follows an absolute systemic erasure. Min-jae didn't move toward them immediately. He seemed to hesitate, his dark eyes raking over his own blood-stained hands as if he were afraid his touch would finally stain the innocence he had just fought to protect. He looked like a monster who had forgotten how to be a man until he saw Amara's eyes widen in recognition. Amara didn't pull back. She didn't cry at the sight of the carnage or the man who looked like he had stepped out of a nightmare. Instead, she lunged forward in Zara's arms, her tiny hands reaching out for Min-jae with the same terrifyingly calm trust she had shown in the kitchen. Zara felt her heart crack as she moved closer, allowing the baby to reach him. Amara's soft, small fingers clapped onto the fresh wound on Min-jae's jaw, her little face scrunched with a sudden, profound concern. "Oh, Amara said clearly, her first word ringing through the bullet-riddled hallway like a bell of redemption. The dragon froze, his expression crumbling for the first time in his adult life. A single, jagged breath escaped him as he pulled both Zara and the child into his arms, burying his face in Amara's hair. In that moment, the Mafia boss was gone, replaced by a man who had finally been saved by the very distraction he had sworn to protect. Zara leaned her forehead against his shoulder, the crippling fear of the last few hours dissolving into a realization that their found family was no longer a secret. It was a survival. 6 months had passed since the night the estate ran red, and the air in the Kang Gardens no longer carried the metallic tang of gunpowder. Instead, it smelled of blooming jasmine and the honest, earthy scent of the flower Zara still insisted on needing herself. The mansion had been transformed from a fortress of controlled violence into a home where the heavy mahogany doors remained unlocked during the day. Kang Min-jae had spent the half-year systematically erasing his dragon persona, liquidating his shadow assets, and dismantling the empire that had once required a storm made flesh to rule. He stood now on the sun-drenched terrace, stripped of his tailored black suit for a simple white linen shirt that caught the breeze. The intricate tattoos on his neck remained, a map of a past life he could never fully leave behind, but the absolute absence of warmth in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady peace. He watched as Amara, now a confident toddler with colorful bows in her hair, chased a butterfly across the manicured lawn. She was no longer a distraction or a litmus test. She was the heartbeat of his new world. Zara walked out to join him, her crippling fear a distant memory, as she leaned against the man who had traded a crown of blood for a chance at a clean slate. She watched Min-jae scoop Amara into his arms, spinning her until her shrieks of laughter filled the gardens. The jagged scar on his jaw, once a mark of war, was now just a place where Amara rested her head when she was tired. Min-jae had found a way to be something other than a monster, proving that even the most feared man in Asia could find redemption in an infant's trust. "The legacy is changed," Min-jae whispered, looking at Zara with a gaze that was almost human and entirely devoted. He had replaced his empire with something more durable, a future where Amara would grow up knowing only the man inside the scars. As the sun set over a city that no longer trembled at his name, the three of them stood together. A found family built on the improbable moment a child reached out to a monster and found a father.